Hello.
Morning.
Morning.
How's your, what is it, Saturday? How's your Saturday?
Yeah. Oh, pretty good so far. How are both of you doing? Oh, there's
Pretty well.
Morgan.
In Oregon?
Hello.
Oh, I don't know. Okay. Jesse will probably be here as well. So, I think Amanda's having trouble with her connection. But so welcome to the meeting. Hope everyone's doing well. We've been. I know we meet like in other meetings during the week, so I've but okay, so any news or updates we want to start with?
Sorry, I'm just getting started here at
Oh, Sam.
7 a.m.
All right. So, do you want to go first, Brian? Okay, it's fine, Amanda.
Yeah, I can go first.
Okay.
Oh my god. So I gave a little bit of an update yesterday in the GSOC meeting. I'm still working on that project. It's great. It's really wonderful. And yeah, we reached our midterm of it, and it's been really exciting. Thanks for the evaluation, Bradley. It's really nice to read. Kind words. Trying to think. Oh, and I'm working on a blog post now to try to sort out my ideas about, or not really my ideas, more just the ideas that are going around about ways of approaching reductionism in cognitive science and the different relationships between Varela's neurophenomenology and more alternative computational strategies and kind of core mathematical foundational ways of getting around this issue of reduction in our conception of the way that cognition works. I'm excited about that perspective because I think that it's a good way to talk to somebody who's really convinced by the reductionist position. You know, you can say, well, there are foundational mathematical decisions that we can actually make that are very explicit and fascinating.
Right.
Like it's very hard science.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard. So I've been working on that, and it's been a lot of fun.
Well, good. I look forward to it. Yeah. And yeah, your project's going well in GSOC. In our Cognition Futures reading group, we've talked about a lot of these things, so I'm glad that that's kind of bearing some fruit. That's great.
Oh yeah.
So you finished up with NeuroMatch as well?
Right. That is the other thing that happened. Yep. And so I just finished the NeuroMatch deep learning, and I'm if anybody wants to join me, I think I'm going to start doing a slow pod on the comp neuro pretty soon, just because doing the deep learning part of NeuroMatch just got me really excited to do the comp neuro part of it, because it was kind of realizing that with deep learning you need a lot of data, and I'm kind of more interested in something from nothing rather than kind of combing through huge amounts of data and making sure it's all right and formatting and everything correctly. So it was good to learn that, and I had a lot of fun. It's a great program.
Yeah, definitely. So this is the third year actually that it's happened. So this is the third one, and yeah, I like how it's evolved, and it's definitely one of these things you can use over and over again. So we want to do a slow pod. I know we've wanted to do this for a while, so this is something that I'd like to talk about a little bit before we dive into it, though. Like just planning out how to do it. And I don't know. We've had a couple people in the Slack interested. You put a message in the I can't remember what channel, maybe NeuroMatch, and you got a couple responses. And so that would be because I talked to Daniela independently about doing this, and so it'd be nice to get like everyone together on, saying what does a slow pod look like.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, like they did one I think in 2020 after the original. There were some other groups, not us, but other groups that did this in 2020 after the original workshop or the original session, and I think they just went slower. They took it, which is fine, but it's like you can also do other things, and I think I mentioned yesterday that you could, for example, dive into a topic and say this is something I'm gonna like kind of present about. I'm gonna give my own take on it or go walk through it a little bit. Just the idea being that you would have this topic that they cover and you would learn something about it, and then you would like take it and give your own take on it. And it may go farther afield than computational neuroscience. It could go to a lot of different things, but you would have that you would have like you would gain some mastery of it by doing that.
Wow, that sounds great.
Yeah. So otherwise you could do it very slowly, but that's like they have like a set of evaluations sort of that they give you in the pot. So like when you do the 3-week session, you're doing it very quickly and you're doing these tutorials and you're doing the slides, and then it's all so quick that you kind of lose track of where you are sometimes, which is nice to have it slowed down. But the value of the tutorials is that you're actually going at a certain rate. So I don't know if that actually gets lost going slower.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I would say going slower, as long as it was steady, like weekly or every few days or something. I think it could still be a good thing with the way that at least the course I just took was structured. Because yeah, oftentimes you'd spend a day on something like a generative adversarial network, like a GAN that like produces text or produces images or produces whatever, and then the next day you're moving on to self-supervised learning, which both of those things you could spend a whole years working on. So it like at certain points it was nice to keep a clip moving, but it was also kind of like, wait a second though, I want to look at this longer, and you couldn't, you had to keep going. So yeah, I don't know. I think, but I think there is something to the steadiness of the information. So whatsoever we do with the slow pod, it'd be nice if it was regular, maybe like the reading group, like a weekly thing. And Danielle's in Italy, right? So her timing needs to be.
Yeah, we'd have to figure that out a little bit more.
Yeah.
But that's true of neuromatch too. It can be asynchronous as well as synchronous. So it's not like we can, we have to have everything at the same time. This is a time that kind of works for people, but not everyone. Like if you're in the afternoon Saturday, it might be different than a morning on a Saturday. Or for Morgan, it's like 7 in the morning. So
I have to be a little quiet.
yeah. Yeah. So that's good. Well, yeah, we'll talk more about that, and I agree about like some of the sort of pacing and some of the activities. Yeah, definitely, though, NeuroMatch is this sort of fire hose approach to learning, where you just open the fire hose and you dump as much information as you can. Yeah, that's unfortunately a lot of the way like graduate school is. You get like your classes, and it's like they dump everything onto you, and then if you whatever you catch, that's great. If not, you have the notes for later. But it's always worth, I think, going through a little bit more slowly and digesting some of it, especially things you really like, because that's useful. Okay. Well, thanks for the update. Does someone else want to give an update?
I can go ahead.
Okay.
I don't really have much to add to what I put in the Slack, but Cognition Futures was great. I've been slowly working on the blog posts. I found a bunch of papers that I dumped in the Slack for the methodologies project. I think that those are the main things. I need to catch up on reading. And I'm definitely interested in any NeuroMatch resources. I definitely would do the slow pod.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. We're going to try to figure out how to do that. So for those papers, what were those? That was just the start of like a bibliography, or
So I've kind of been using that channel as just like a place to put papers that seem relevant to the project, even though we've not sorted out the details of the project yet. So one of them is it's a collection edited by Varela. The rest I think were just papers. Most of them were fairly recent. So yeah, just like to start an annotated bibliography.
okay. Yeah, that's good. And I know Jesse, we talked about. Well, we have some methods for organizing some of those, but we can talk about that later. Getting the papers in order, because like when we put them in a Slack channel, we can share them, but we should have like a more formal bibliography software. I think we have been using Zotero, but we've kind of fallen out of practice. That's the one problem. Oh,
Obsidian for myself.
yeah, we could use that. I mean, the problem, with using like any one thing is we have to be consistent. And that's where we've fallen down with Zotero. We haven't really been using it that regularly, so it gets out of sync. And it's useful if you have it, but I don't necessarily find it useful always. I mean, like when I'm writing a paper, I'll just know kind of some references if I'm reading, or I'll look them up, and then maybe sometimes I'll go back to the bibliography, but. Best practices are bibliography, but other people organize them in different ways. And actually, I think for annotated bibliography, maybe Obsidian is pretty good because you'll have your notes right there. So,
Yeah. I think this is where Notion is going to come in handy for us because, I think there's I don't time has been a bit I'll get into my updates a bit later. I may not be able to talk a whole lot right now, but on this specific topic, people doing and reading stuff and taking notes, that's it's kind of up to you. I don't want to be too. I actually had a conversation about this last night with some grad students and stuff. But it's kind of like, I'm not, especially in the lab right now, I'm not really in a position to say, hey, everybody should be using this technique, this tool to do this right now. And I don't want to do that. And that's not really how it's set up anyway. And it's mostly just like, what can you do? But when I say Notion comes in handy, is like eventually, and kind of what I'm starting to do with some of the other projects. But for the condition future, for the research methods project specifically, I think Notion will be a really nice way to store if we should definitely have an annotated bibliography for the methods project, like a formal one. And we can store data there in an accessible way that the whole team can see. Because that's kind of what it comes down to. Like we actually have, I think Notion is great for having an actual, you can post the files in it, and it's not a big deal. You can post the file, you can post your annotated bibliography, you can organize it, you can even create different tables to organize things in a specific way. And I feel like that would be a fairly powerful research tool when we come to writing papers, and also showing. I've been looking at how like Jenny does stuff in plot twisters, and other people have been doing things too, but kind of using it as a practice, using Notion as sort of a practice of being open source or open science and how we do stuff to make it. It's not going to be the most visible, accessible thing in the world, but if we put like a slightly refined thing in that space, it will kind of be like we're building a much longer term thing for the future, so for the lab or for people doing this, interested in this field. And I think that's kind of why I made the shift in Notion, because I feel like longer term it will have a lot of use that way. But to that end, I haven't quite set up some of that. I have done a little bit, but I haven't had enough time to do everything else, particularly with the We Robot deadline, which I've actually asked for. I've actually wonder if they got back to me yet, but I'm going to see if they have any kind of an extension. Not because I really need it, just because I'm curious.
Oh.
So I imagine they might extend a little bit anyway, but I asked them outright because a little more time is always nice. Anyway,
Yeah.
And I'm going to please continue, Amanda. Sorry.
I guess one more thing to add is when I was thinking about the first blog post idea of how Varela's project differs from other uses of like embodiment and enactivism in the literature. When I was going back through the Martini paper, I think that a short version of the answer to that question of how he uses the word is that Varela is using enactivism and embodiment to refer to like the methodology, the practice of doing the science, whereas in other areas that cognition is embodied or enacted or embedded or whichever one seems to be more like a feature of the model that you're trying to build instead of something about the process of building the model. So in my quick research so far, I think that is the distinction that I'm seeing, which is obviously like relevant to our other projects.
Yeah, and I think the Martini critique is kind of saying, let's try to continue to push that forward. Whereas other people have kind of been like, oh, well, yes, of course, it's embodied. I think that's an interesting point, and one that I would like to explore more.
Yeah, this idea of process versus feature of the system, it's a pretty good insight. I
think that would be important, like that would be a really, particularly almost in like a frontier map. I was gonna say something like frontier Mappian sense, but I'm not gonna say frontier map sense. That's like a critical juncture or divide, and so yeah, I'm glad for you to point that out. You were saying, Bradley? Sorry.
Oh no, yeah, I thought this feature versus process idea is really interesting. There is you could argue that some of this computational agent stuff with embodiment, like especially like in robotics, does sort of straddle that divide a little bit, because you don't think about like process methodology as well. Robots are a methodology in cognitive science. It's if you want to study some system and you want to like build it, and then see if your hypothesis works, you can build it in a robot and use it in the real world, and then you have this model of cognition that you've kind of created. We also do that to some extent with cell culture as well, or with some of these other systems that we've talked about. But that's the role of embodiment there is actually pretty explicit. So you can embody something like a robot, what they call a hybrid, with which is like a cell culture or some other type of neuronal control in a robot, or you can have like something like a Bradenberg vehicle where you have a little agent that has a body. The body is important in the operation of the robot. And so that's the difference there between just like a standard neural network and something with a body. And it's there's actually an anatomical set of relations. So you have like a head and a tail, and it's important where the head is versus the tail, and that sort of thing. Now with embodiment being a feature, you could point to something as like being embodied and say that's nice. So I don't know how that all plays out. But I think that's a very good point. I think there are some really good examples you could pull out of modern cognitive science that are really can draw the distinction out. Okay.
Yeah, and I think we said this before, but at our discussion group last year, which I maintain was actually a pretty awesome discussion group about trajectories in cognitive science. Like, I think that was honestly really great. And I looked at, now that I'm a little more familiar with the discussion groups held at main CogSci conference, I think ours was awesome.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like this year, I feel like they did a much narrower scope, and that's fine. We had our group was called Trajectories in Cognitive Science, and we looked at like a whole bunch of topics that they covered this year. Like, we talked about neurodivergence, we talked about methodologies, which they didn't cover this year. We talked about we didn't talk about mentorship explicitly. We talked about like frontier map stuff and trajectories and development and like a lot of things like that. But I mentioned this specifically not just to toot our own horns, but I think I said this enough times for everybody here to know it, but just to say it again, one of our things within one of our talks or topics within that panel was the role of development in psychology and cognitive science or whatever. We went through this paper by, I think it was like Arenti or something, and she basically was saying like, yeah, that would be, let's say that maybe is technically our, in the cognition futures science anyway, that's probably our first that's actually our first actual paper about methodology, because basically it's saying methodology is tough to study, and methodology is tough to study, but development is tough to study, and here's how it's been used, and here's what we've kind of been able to do. We're running up methodological roadblocks to study methodological roadblocks to study development itself, and she kind of steered heavily into, let's try to use developmental robotics to do it, and that was kind of her, her question was, can we use this methodology, to push us forward about some of our lackings. So I look forward to having a little bit more time so I can start putting together things in Notion, and just for the project. The project really needs a little bit of administrative structuring, and but it's urgent, but it's also like, people, please write the blog post, read the reading group, like, do the stuff you want to do. Like, we can, it's not like we have to just stop the train and okay, let me put this, like, arrange some pages in Notion. No. But the urgency, I'm mostly just saying out loud for myself. So that's what I'm saying it so I can hear it again for myself. That's all. But yeah.
Yeah, we always have these issues with like reorganizing, because the way the nature of this group is, or the lab is, like, we're constantly churning and trying to find different pathways forward, and we have people coming in, and so it's like, that it always changes. I was just looking at the stuff from the Representational Brains and Phenotypes website, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, this doesn't really reflect exactly what's going on here. There's some historical things, and then now we're kind of shifting in a little bit different direction, but it's always like, how do you summarize all that for people? That's yeah.
And it's what my latest stab with this was some of the stuff with, like, how I'm organizing things, or using my, like, the Joe Pro stuff and the organization things that I'm doing, and thinking about things in certain ways. Like, I'm trying to now I really believe the methodology project itself will be a very nice project, like a long-term project. And I feel like that's going to help. The vision for that project is, at least in my mind, becoming fairly clear. And I think writing that out will be great, so we can show people this. That also helps structure how to organize stuff for it. And that's been something that's been a little bit challenging at times, because when you're in certain phases of projects or understanding what you want to do, like, it's just the structure isn't the same. So anyway, I'm kind of bleeding into lab admin talk at this point, but yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for the update, Amanda. So, do we have Samantha? Do you want to give an update?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So not a really big update this week. Basically, I've been preparing like my stuff to start working again when I go back to school in like a week and a half. So I've been getting sidetracked with that. And then the other thing I've done this week with Jesse is we've started talking about the interview he wanted to do with what I've done as my summer project and working. So that's my main update. And I'm looking forward to the questions Jesse asked me. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you wrote a lot. That's great. I mean, maybe with some light editing in a couple questions, like that's, we'll edit everything for discretion and privacy as much as you want, of course. But I mean, what you wrote is very thorough, and later on today or this weekend, I'll have a bit more to say. But I mean, I think that's great, and I think what you're doing is great too. So yeah, thank you for putting that together.
Yeah, and thank you for asking me. I love like my summer project. I didn't think like it's like that big, but when you like offered to ask me questions, it was great. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that looked. Yeah, I saw the write up. That looked really good. So, this is something that Jesse, you want to fashion into some sort of blog post or something like that.
Yeah. It's a great. I mean, it sounds like a really great experience, and I think just making having some kind of a write up about it. It's always good to. It's good. It's a good thing to show off and good to practice and to talk about, and I think it's the kind of thing that I think it's a great thing overall. So we can turn it into something that is visible and helps kind of make an artifact about the experience, and that's always a good thing to do, especially things like that, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't clear. You asked me about questions to ask Samantha, and I wasn't clear on what the. I kind of got lost in that.
Yeah,
bit.
you might have not been present for some of that, or like it didn't make sense. I was basically saying, before Amanda, or excuse me, before Sam wrote out all that stuff, I'm like, oh, let's think about some things to structure the interview, like how should we, how do you want to structure the write up? But that was kind of before Sam wrote everything out. So I was like, oh, okay, like I think that's a bit more. Now that I have all this context, we can just think, I'll take from that. And if you still have questions you want to have Sam answer in the blog post, you can.
Okay, yeah.
That is about that, basically. But.
Yeah.
I guess a question for Sam, like, again, no pressure to answer this now, but like, do you want, is school starting up, and there's been a lot of talk about like AI empathy stuff and the things that you're interested in. I don't know what you're planning to do for the fall, and if you have any projects you want to work on in the fall, or if we want to take a break and focus on other things in the fall too. That's all. Any options of those are fine. And you don't have to say anything now, but just think. I know you're thinking about the future, and I guess I would say let us know. What you're thinking you want to do in the fall, because there's a lot of things that we can shift and build out I don't know. I'm actually really curious. I think I'm hoping to hear from Sadhna soon about some stuff, because I think she may be interested in some similar things to you, and I'm not quite sure what she's doing in this fall yet. But basically, when if you have any thoughts about what you'd like to do in the fall, let us know in the Slack, because we're as a tangent to that. Riley and I are starting to do some planning about the future. Also, Casey, anybody who's in UAlbany, Casey is the person from Kersey. I still call it Curse, but the person from Undergraduate Research Center. She sent out an email this week, I believe, kind of saying, "Hey, we're gearing up for fall internships, so we have funding, we have all this other stuff. So if people want to get, if you want credit for anything in the lab and want to do that through, Casey can help get you academic credit for the fall. And also, if you want to apply for grants for funding through UAlbany, let us know, because I've done it. I've gotten grant money. Woo! But getting a grant is huge. Writing grant proposals is very significant to your academic future. And money's nice also. So if we can help you write a grant or a proposal or do anything, I don't know. I know Casey's always adding new stuff, but anybody who wants help in that way or plans on taking this internship, plans on doing stuff with the lab for academic credit through UAlbany in the fall, please let us know about that, and we can start to facilitate that for you. So yeah, that's my general comment about that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Is that all you wanted to say, Sam? I don't wanna.
Yeah, pretty much that was it. But thank you for all the advice with the Kersey stuff. I've looked into the Kersey program and haven't, because I need the research credits for a program and then not that, so I got confused. But thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And Casey is really great. I went to the information sessions for the grant that Jesse's talking about. There's just a grant that UAlbany will just give to their undergraduates, and they were telling me that most people don't apply, so
They don't.
but they always end up not being able to give out all of the money. So the information session I went to was basically saying, if you apply, you're probably gonna get it. So just apply.
Yeah.
We have more money than we have applicants, so apply.
Yeah, and it's I could talk a long time about this, and we don't need to do this, but just for a smidgen of context, back in my day, because I'm a man and an alumnus and all this stuff now, I was there before Kersey is very much in development, and I'm super happy for it. Casey was the first person I reached out to when some other opportunities for me arose, because I'm like, Casey, at one point I want to make my own fellowship or grant or something, because this is so huge for me, just to have even just her support. And at the time they didn't even have that much stuff going on, and now it's more fleshed out. Each year they're doing better and better and better, but at the same time, they need to give money to students to say this is working. And so it's so weird, because UAlbany is such a huge university, but some of their research opportunity marketing and exposure is still very, very, very new. And so I always try to hype up and talk about Casey stuff, Casey and Kersey, I suppose. But yeah, like please, even if you know, if you like, honestly, like this is a side comment, but if you know people at U Albany who aren't sure about what to do, or want to talk to them about the funding thing, like I, as an alumnus, am happy to help, or basically say, do it, do it, and I'll help you apply if you're nervous or something. But just please support undergraduate research efforts. That's my soapbox about that, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, I'll be talking to you about this later, Jesse, because I tried to apply last year. And I was under the impression I needed support from a professor, and the professors at U Albany are so overworked, especially at least in the computer science department, that they just do not have time. So
yeah, I'll tell you how I did that, and the short answer is sometimes if you do things the right way, sometimes with academia you have to say, hey, I've done all this stuff, professor. You don't have to do anything but just sign this. They're like, all right, yeah. And that's basically what happened for me.
Yeah.
And the guy, but like, ask the right people, because some people will like, and then people will be like, oh yeah, sure, whatever, I don't care, go.
Yeah. Let's meet about it sometime this coming week or something. That'd be great.
All right, let's do it. Okay. Any other comments or updates? I suppose. I don't know. You Albany conversation time, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sam, for giving your update. And then Jesse, did you have any other updates you wanted to give? Morgan, maybe if you want to give an update too.
I mean, I wrote some of my update in the Slack, and I might have a more extended conversation with. I had a very interesting conversation with a graduate, someone that. It's so weird. They call their program GISD.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait, you know, there's no way that you mean GISD, like our GISD, JISTI.
Yeah.
JIESI.
Yes, yeah.
I was like, what are you saying GISD? It's like, oh well, we also call it Grandma Said Don't. I really like that one. GSD. Grandma Said Don't, or there was a bunch of other ones, but I can't remember that one right now. But like, it's the Graduate School of Design, but it's GSD. And I'm like, oh, it's just GSD. Okay, sure. But I'm like, yeah, all the people in the GSD program, I'm like, it took me like 10 times hearing it to really know what they meant. It's like, oh, you're just being an acronym that's not our GSD, my GSD.
Trying to pronounce an acronym, it's never good.
Right. And it's like, what? But the Graduate School of Design, and they, we had a great conversation about that. So I might wax a bit more poetically about that later when we have a designated time block for it. I may talk a little bit about some of the We Robot stuff today, but I did not get to put all of my ideas into poster format, so I don't have an update. I'll show it briefly later on, but I basically, if anybody's at the last meeting I did with, I forget, I think it was just Amanda, but the posters, it's basically a skeleton right now, but it's ready, it's kind of ready to be made. Like, I feel pretty good about the condition, the poster number 1. Beyond that, I have continued to set up some things in Notion. I've done some administrative work. I've done some I'll just put it this way about I had a part of the conversation I had that serves well. I can say here's an update is the We Robot posters they're an example of something that I didn't fully well, actually, let's I might just put all this in a segment of like, I have some, I would like to have like a small, maybe 10 to 15 minute discussion about some professional development, academic development related stuff. And maybe I can just put this conversation there. There was also a really, really, really good thing, and someone I may want to not necessarily partner with, but like someone really, I found someone on social media, actually Instagram of all places, who had a really interesting take on being a graduate researcher compared to like what your role is against sometimes you're doing all the work of an entire research team, and not just being overworked as a graduate student, but like what does it mean to do those different roles. So I feel like that's something maybe to talk about in its own segment. I've had a lot of interesting conversations this week. I pushed some projects forward. I'm ever wary in a healthy way of August 8th deadline for We Robot. And I feel like, it's just a constant, I respect all the people who are doing stuff for the summer, like congratulations, Brian, for not just the NeuroMatch, but like doing all the stuff and the ABM course and everything else. And I know Amanda's like constantly reading papers, and like we're all doing a lot. And Sam had a great summer project, and Morgan's always looking at stuff, and Bradley's being Bradley all the time. So we all feel good about ourselves that way. But it just feels like this ever. As a personal sentiment update, like I feel like I'm hitting a point in my life where, not in an oppressive or bad way, but like I feel the every day is exciting because I feel this sort of tension between, do I get to allocate time to push some of my projects forward or not? Do I, what was like the opportunity cost? A lot of times it feels really stressful, honestly. Like I don't like, when I talk about things like the way that I'm saying it feels like, oh, I have so much to do, I don't have time, this is like, blah, 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 but I'm happy because right now this process feels like almost a bit fun and strategic, and I don't know, like there's just a lot of stuff that I'm very happy to do, but it's sort of like, it's even today and even yesterday and last night, like last night was Friday night, and it's like I had another like nice conversation with some students and academic nerd people, and that led to a lot of things I might say later in the professional development segment. So I'm going to cut myself off here, okay, and then say, I don't know what do you want to, how do you want to arrange the rest of the meeting, I guess, today?
I'm going to go over some NeuroMatch things, and then maybe I wanted to discuss this figure you requested. It's like this continuum of like embodiment or something like that.
Oh,
I wanted to
like,
go over that.
Put it in,
well,
I know you said you were
I wanted to do an interactive session, so I'll and then readings. If you want to do like the 10 minutes on professional development, we can do that too.
Yeah,
okay.
That sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. Morgan, do you want to go?
No, sorry, not any big updates. But following along, and as always, I love everybody's links.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Just a couple papers that have come out, and I dropped there's an issue of Cell that like it looks so great, and I can't get any of the articles.
Oh.
So it's like oh, this person. I've only read the abstracts, but they look awesome.
Which one is that?
I dropped it into Brain Organoids.
Okay.
So I think it's the 21st, and and it's got people like and forgive me for the pronunciation, but I think it's Noblick, who was the original cerebral organoid person, in Vienna. Together with Madeline Lancaster, but as well as Ventnor's there, and the head of the Tarasky Institute. It's like it's got all these people, and unfortunately, Sci-Hub is not does not have those available currently.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go check out, see if I can get the paper copy from the library.
Yeah. Let's take. I think Brian put it in the chat. So this is. I can share my screen actually. We can look at it a little bit. So this is Sal. This is special issue, I guess, on biotech. So are there any papers that we should point out?
Sorry, now I'll put my glasses back on. Yeah,
right.
If you scroll down a little more, and then you'll get. I'm always interested when people are looking at ancient DNA, but
right.
This transcriptome, connectome, neuromodulation. Blake Richards, Zador, like these are all people where it's like if they had an article, I'd want to read it.
Yeah.
And so metabolic analysis, it just reminds me that Nick Lane's got a new book that I think came out July 12th, which I think is called Transformer. So he's someone who focuses again on metabolic cellular metabolism.
Yeah.
And has some great books. And on the subject of transformers, I think DeepMind has a nice review of transformer architectures, or like a survey of transformer architectures. That's a new paper. I'll drop a link to that. And I just saw that it's there's summer school videos and things from summer school in France, statistical physics summer school in France that looks good. Again, I'll drop that. And then computational psychiatry, really interesting. Something that I've wanted to see, but is like epigenetic. I guess there's an Illumina platform for looking at epigenetics that gives you a better sense of kind of cellular age, and and it's showing in increased aging in schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. So this goes back to this idea that longevity research is actually going to be of interest to psychiatry. Again, connects us back to development in general. And so lots of things coming out, but I wish there was more general article access.
Yeah, it's always a challenge.
I mean, it's like if they're not going to publish on Archive or bioRxiv or something, then,
Yeah, that cell issue looks really good. We'll have to look at that a little bit more. Yeah.
I might sneak into the UCSF library.
Yeah.
Brian said he has access.
Okay. Yeah.
Even better. I will. Yes. I will DM you.
This is about as off the record as you can be in a live recorded session, but I encourage sneaking into libraries, and that's all I'll say.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Morgan, for the update. So why don't I go over, I'm going to go over the third week of NeuroMatch. So this is the computational neuroscience version, not the deep learning version. And, this is maybe the one we should do the slow pod on, I think, since this is our main interest in the group. I just wanted to go over the different weeks. So the first week we did the first week's curriculum, kind of looked it over. Second week we did the curriculum. So the first week was like model building, and then the second week we talked about some other models. The third week now, it's actually, there's a lot of stuff. So I don't want to go over all of it in detail. I just want to go over like what was covered and maybe, you know, the things that we can think about for what we're interested in for maybe our slow pod. So once again, this is the link here, compneuro.neuromatch.io. There's a tutorials page under that. And again, here's the thing on the left. So you have the prerequisites that they've set up this year, where you have, you can get up to speed on Python, you can get up to speed on linear algebra, calculus, statistics. Those are all things you really need for this. Do intro to modeling, machine learning, dynamical systems. And then in the third week, they talk about stochastic processes. And so I think in yesterday's meeting, in the GSOC meeting, we talked about stochastic processes a little bit. And, it's easy to gloss over this, but so stochastic processes are processes that generate sort of a random outcome, or it's randomized. It's not really random necessarily. It's sort of a randomized outcome. So the idea is that you have this process that's generating something, and it's not deterministic. So it's not spitting out like a discrete state, maybe at a regular interval or at a certain probability. It's generating things. It's almost like when you roll dice and you have a certain outcome. So like when you roll your dice, you don't know what side is going to come up. And of course, this is great for casinos because they can take your money, because you really can't predict stochastic processes in advance. You just observe them, they come out, and then you can just, you can maybe predict their mean behavior, but you can't predict any one stochastic process trial. So that's the idea. Now in this section, they kind of talk a little bit about stochastic processes kind of broadly. And so they just introduce a lot of different methods here. So the first one is Bayesian decisions. And so this is where they talk about Bayesian models and Bayesian decisions. In the first year that they did NeuroMatch, I have these lectures still. We may go over these lectures in our slow pods. I prepared a series of lectures that were sort of supplemental to what people were learning week by week in NeuroMatch. So I have a lecture on Bayesian modeling for like the conceptual aspects of it. It's not just the math and the sort of applications of the brain. It's a little bit broader than that, but we'll talk about that as we go along. But Bayesian models are a class of models where you have, I think we've talked about Bayesian models. You have a prior that you have to characterize from the data, and it's usually a distribution. So all stochastic processes rely on having a distribution. So you can't just say, this is what I've seen in the past, this is what I'll see in the future. You have to have a distribution from which to draw. And so this allows you to draw from different parts of the distribution and then match it to what you've observed in the world, and then build a posterior distribution where it kind of reconciles the two things. And then it can feed back to the prior where, it updates the prior, and you have a better prediction from there. So this is one way you can predict stochastic processes, or you can predict, some sort of system with structure that has a stochastic quality where you can't predict exactly what the outcome is, but it's definitely something that you have to work at to sort of figure out how to characterize it or how to approximate it. So they use Bayesian inference widely in neuroscience. And in this one, this is Bayes for brains. What should the brain compute? So let's see. If they have why Bayes for the brain. So, they kind of get into normative models, the role of probabilistic normative models. So this idea of stochasticity I just told you about really does draw from this idea of a probabilistic model. So you want to say you can predict something with a certain probability, but you can't say that that's exactly what's going to happen. So, I can say, for example, that, the next color you might see is blue with a certain probability, but, I may be right or wrong on that. I can be close to what the next color is, but I can't say for certain. So I use a probabilistic model. And people use probabilistic models in different ways. Probabilistic models require you to have a distribution to draw from, so you can draw from different parts of that distribution and make a statement and then match it with what you see in reality. So they focus in this course on Gaussians, which are what you might think of as the normal distribution. So a normal distribution is a bell curve, if you know what a bell curve is. And it's very good for modeling things that are what they call normally distributed, which means that you have a lot of things around what we might call the average, and then some things out in the tails, but not too many things out in the tails. So your stochastic process will operate within a certain tight range around a mean. It'll vary around the mean somewhat, but then you'll have your tails that you'll have outliers, but they won't be so great so as to really kind of throw off your predictions. This is actually contrasts with other types of distributions, like exponential distributions, where you have what they call long tails, which are where a lot of things happen in the tail, and it's kind of hard to predict from using things like the mean. You have to use other moments of that distribution to say something, to summarize what that distribution is all about. In any case, in the brain, what they're going to say here is that you can use Gaussians very effectively in the brain. And they get into Mara's 3 levels of analysis, and this is always kind of a thing in computational neuroscience that they like to talk about, because it gets into these 3 different levels. And this is something, I think, more broadly, Mara was a cognitive scientist who studied vision, so this is a more broad sort of observation of the analysis of like cognitive systems. So the first level is computation. What problems does the brain solve and why? So we want to ask, that's one level of analysis. The next level is representation and algorithm. What is the representation of input and output? And what steps transform these representations? So this is, the algorithmic level. And it's different from the computational level because it's a little bit deeper into, solving for something, And then the last level of analysis is implementation. How does the brain achieve these computations? So you basically go by defining the problem of what the brain is trying to do. Then you try to figure out the representation, the inputs, the outputs, the steps for transformation, and then you get to implementation, which is how does the brain achieve these computations. So you can see that it's just levels of like you have to define the terms of what you're modeling, then you can apply a predictive model, and then you can say things about the predictive model that make sense. And so that's why we have these 3 levels. And you'll encounter this, especially if you're, especially if we're interested in cognitive science and how cognitive science makes predictions and why cognitive science is structured the way it is. This may not be the best way to approach this, but this is the traditional way. So we get into normative modeling. So this is very much like what we would think of in this Gaussian world, in this sort of predictive world. And so normative modeling describes the task itself. So, this is where you're trying to model something that cognition does. So, they're showing like the pole vault here, which is if you could model a pole vault, that's a model. It's not a great model, it's stick figures, but it shows basically how this works. So in normative modeling, you describe the task itself, and you can think in the brain, what is it that the brain does that we can describe? And maybe we can't describe everything, at least not now. But like things like cognitive functions like attention, maybe memory, we can describe those at a certain level. And then we have guidance about what to expect from behavior. So what should an animal do? So we want to look at like the norm of what the animal does. Of course, the animal does a lot of things that are not normal or not in that normative sense. but that's not really what we're interested in. We're interested in, like, this is a pole vault. This is the way it's usually done. It could be done maybe in other ways, but we don't care about that. And so it's that Gaussian world. We care about the mean behavior. Then we have to have some benchmark for judging performance. So this is oftentimes we talk about benchmarks in machine learning, and that's what we want to do here as well. We want to have benchmarks. So in cognitive science, they have different tasks that people do, or machines do sometimes. And those tasks are part of the field. You'll go into a class and they'll say, this the Tower of Hanoi problem, for example, is a good problem for sequential decision making and optimizing a process. And that's something that they use again and again throughout experiments because they know it works, they know what the effect is, and so forth. And then normative modeling does not answer how-to questions. So it's just really about this normative behavior of a system around these benchmark tasks, and it doesn't really answer how to. In other words, I can't go to a brain and say how do you give you a how-to manual on how to become conscious. That's not really the idea here. It's just normative types of modeling. So you have different things like insect eyes optimally balance resolution and diffraction. You can look at a variety of insect eyes, and you can look at the ommatidia, which is the part of an insect eye. Like, insect has hundreds of these ommatidia, and they all are involved in vision. You can measure these, and you can measure this against eye size, and you can come up with a quantitative measure, an output from this. And you can look across different insect eyes with ommatidia, this basic architecture, and you can make a generalization. Now, not all insects are going to fall along this line, but we want to build a model so that we can look at the sort of normative output or normative behavior, and we can get to rules and laws. Sometimes, for some insects, and I'm writing a paper right now on what I call super perceivers, where in some insect species, for example, they sample their visual world at a very high rate. That's not a necessarily normative model, but it's something that is interesting. But the normative model is really looking at what happens across, say, insects, and what are the sort of the general principles we can extract from that. And so it just goes on through mental models of the world, and it kind of gets through a lot of these issues about probabilities and the difference between Bayesian likelihoods and probabilities, and so we can go through this more in the pod or in the slow pod if we want. Then there are hidden dynamics, which is a little bit different approach. In hidden dynamics, they talk about hidden Markov models. So I think we've talked about hidden Markov models in the GSOC group, and this is where you have hidden states in systems. So when we make a model of a system, if we want to make, say, a Markov model, and I've talked about Markov models, there are these models of discrete states and transitions between the states that have probabilities attached to them. But sometimes you don't know all the states in your system. You just know that there's states, and we try to characterize what we can see that are obvious to us. But sometimes they're hidden states. And so this is actually a tool that's been used very effectively in speech processing, trying to find hidden states in a system, and use it, then leveraging that to sort of make better predictions. So they talk about hidden Markov models in this section. So hidden states in time, they talk about actually linking it to the brain in terms of sleep states. Then we have these different types of neurophysiological data that we can look at that have states. But those states are, sometimes they're obvious in the data. Sometimes we have to apply some technique to extract states from the data. So when we want to identify states, we can see maybe there are a couple of clusters here. So maybe those are our states. Well, we don't really know that. We just know that there are clusters in the data, that we're measuring this stuff, and maybe they're stable states. If you're doing something with dynamical systems, or whether you're doing some sort of interpretation of like a dimensionality reduction. You're interested in like the pattern of the behavior of the system. So if you have a plot like this, you might have a couple of clusters and you might say, well, those are the states. But that's not necessarily good enough. You may want to analyze this data further using a hidden Markov model to try to extract other states that might be important in this process. So, you're just really asking about, aside from what is a state, you're trying to get to like what are all the states in the system, or what are the important states in the system. So they have a lot of technical background here that's necessary to understand hidden Markov models. So hidden state models, which is the same thing, they don't put Markov on it, have two uses in neuroscience. The first is we want to infer hidden states in our data to understand the brain. So we have at time t, the brain is in a hidden state, and we collect data y. So the goal is to infer the hidden states from this data. Two is that the brain wants to infer hidden states in the world and make decisions. So one is that neurophysiological type of hidden state where we want to see what the hidden states are in the data from the brain. But the second is that the brain itself is trying to infer hidden states to make decisions. So our brains actually do this where we're trying to infer things from the world as opposed to like just actually doing operations, and then those operations have some structure. So we're actually interested in both of those. In the second case, at time t, the world is in hidden state S, and the brain senses data y. And then the goal there is to determine optimal inference to compare behavior and brain activity. So this is an interesting thing because, typically you would think, well, you just find the hidden states in the environment. But here, the brain itself is doing things. It's trying to infer hidden states, but the neurophysiology is also maybe in a hidden state that we don't know about. So this is all important if you want to really understand what the brain is doing, especially in a case where it's doing a lot of inference, it's doing a lot of reflexivity and things like that. And we've talked about that in the Cog Futures sessions. So this is a hidden state data example where you have a network with multiple firing rate states. So you're trying to find a hidden state amongst these multiple firing rates. You might think, well, just the firing rate itself is a good criterion, but there are all sorts of structure in this data, and you want to find all of the possible important states. And so we're trying to, this goes into Bayesian modeling a little bit with beliefs and things like that. So they kind of get into the math of that. And then they get into Markov chains, and these are the Markov models that I've shown you, the finite state machines that people use to model discrete systems with state transitions. And what you're trying to do is add on to this, where you're adding in states and adding in transitions. And of course, these probabilities will change as you add in things. Okay, so that's probably enough about that. Let's see. How about optimal control? So optimal control then is really about drawing inferences from a hidden state. So this is about, all right, so this intro video teaches you about the formalism. You have a dynamic process that you get to act upon, and you choose your actions to maximize the utility function. So in this case, we're actually looking at sort of optimizing what's going on in the brain. So you're using, in the fishing example, so there's two running examples in this tutorial, fishing and astrocat, for binary and Gaussian variables. So binary is just the 0, 1. Gaussian is where you're drawing from a distribution. In the fishing example, you'll use your hidden Markov model to figure out where the fish are. So you're trying to infer where the fish are. And then update your fishing location to catch the most fish. So you're trying to optimize your behavior based on the information about where fish are in space. In the astrocat example, you will learn to use the cat's jetpack to keep the cat on target. So this is a kind of a motor control example. So this is drawing from a distribution, and matching the speed with the output, so you're able to observe the world. It's a sort of closed loop control where you're trying to match your state in the world with your actions driving you forward. So that's the AstroCAD example. And then you have to sort of build a model of that. So these are two different ways, the AstroCAD being the Gaussian variable, the fishing example being the binary example. So there are two ways to do this. So this is something we might draw from as well. Optimization is pretty broadly applicable in neuroscience, despite the brain not being necessarily, or behavior not necessarily being optimal. Reinforcement learning, and we've talked about reinforcement learning a lot, but they have a module on that, and it kind of goes through reinforcement learning. And of course, reinforcement learning is a computational paradigm, but it's also something that happens in the brain, which was actually the dominant form of understanding behavior before the cognitive revolution and cognitive science came about. So people, used to do these experiments where they would look at, like, if you reinforced animals' behavior with rewards, or if you inhibited an animal's behavior with punishments, you could get a certain outcome. It would define learning, but there were a number of problems with that. Most likely, one of the most common objections was that it doesn't really model things like attention. There are other things, like it doesn't model knowledge very well. So there are different things. And of course, reinforcement learning as a computational paradigm has gone beyond what the sort of experimental paradigms were in, say, like before the cognitive revolution. But still, this is definitely a certain sort of take on it's a behavioral analogy, but it's also this certain one aspect of cognition, which is learning and reinforcing behaviors and things like that. So it's definitely an adaptive behavior type of technique, and so we can talk about that in the slow pod as well. And then there's network causality, which is the final part of this. And network, of course, Conrad Courting is really into causality, and there's a lot of stuff that people have done on causality that doesn't get as much attention maybe as it deserves, especially like in deep learning and machine learning. But in neuroscience, causal questions are everywhere. And it's one of the things that when you see statistical results, you often have this problem of if there's a correlation between two things, or even if there's like a significant result between two things, it doesn't imply causation. It just implies correlation. It just implies a relationship between two things that occur often enough together that you can make some positive statement about their association. So, for example, correlation is when two things happen together, like two neurons firing simultaneously. We can say that those two things are correlated, but we can't necessarily say that if one causes the other, or if there's a causal relationship between the two. That's a different kettle of fish. And there are different tests that you can use for causality. There are different approaches to causality. Judea Pearl is a famous thinker in this area, and he's written a number of books. They mentioned Judea Pearl here. They're computer science. He's in computer science, but these are really applicable to any discipline, and especially computational neuroscience. So there are a lot of things that Judea Pearl's worked on in terms of different methods for looking at causality. There are other people who have done a lot of other stuff with, like causal modeling, causal networks, things like that. So there's a lot of work, but I think the thing to say about this is it's not, when you have a correlation, you have a significant statistical result. It isn't necessarily causality. In a lot of science, we have problems with causality and establishing it. And sometimes it's actually very costly, because sometimes you can have, you can make an observation that something exists. Something is a process that unfolds, like some sort of neuronal process, some sort of disease state. and we can do an experiment and observe that this happens, but we don't know what's causing it. It could be a gene, it could be the environment, and genes and environment are a different area that we won't get into. But let's suppose, for example, that we had a number of candidates for a cause. Now, we can't necessarily get at that cause through just doing some statistical testing. We need something a little bit different. We need to figure out like what came first. We need to figure out what, if something is conditionally dependent on something else. So there are different ways to think about this. And so this is, I think, the most exciting part of this whole thing, because it really kind of gets in, and this is actually very philosophical in a lot of ways, because there are a lot of issues here of like, there's statistical methods, but there's a philosophical aspect to it that I think is really interesting. And they do get into some medical conditions here where you have different, different conditions that people might have, like, some disease, and there are different characteristics of the patient. And we have to figure out, we have to do some calculations. This is a Bayesian or a conditional probability of your condition versus some potential causal factor. And so, you can set up problems like that. But I think causality is really about how to establish the problem, how to take your data and use it effectively to see some of these causal issues. So when we say, what came first, the chicken or the egg, we can actually make a statement about that. And it's not, it makes sense. So I'm gonna stop there because we're already pretty far along on time. But did we have any comments about any of that? I know it was a whirlwind, but
just that it just gets better and better in terms of all its material.
Yeah. So yeah, if we want to do the slow pod, I would suggest that we pick some things that we go through, like week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 1 might take like 5 weeks, but to take one piece of that and say, this is something that I really find interesting. I'm going to explore this further. I want to go into that reading, and you can go through their slides, just walking through it and have discussions, or you can take your own sort of what you think about it and kind of put it into context. And there's just so many things here to explore. It's just, you're trying to pack all this in, you're trying to give some understanding to it, but there's just so much there, it's really hard to get a full appreciation for it. Okay, so that's NeuroMatch, and then that's it for the, which is a lot. So, congratulations again to Brian for completing deep learning. Yeah. So now I want to any questions or comments at this point. Okay. Now I want to move on to our discussion of Jesse's figure. So I have if we have it in here, where I put this in the Slack somewhere. Oh, it was in We Robot, yeah. So we have We Robot. I can't remember where he asked me this question, but I gave him some answer. I gave him some figures that I put into the. Oh, here it is. Do you have any thoughts about diagramming levels of embodiment, levels of fidelity? So it means model fidelity. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen, actually. I need to do that. Do you have any thoughts about diagramming this out? I think that it might be a good diagram or combined diagram somehow, but I'm not sure best how to convey it. So I wanted to take a stab at it, but I wasn't really sure myself. So I did a talk last year on model fidelity in biology, and this is one of the figures from the talk, and this is about like models and model fidelity. So this is what level of fidelity and type of detail is acceptable for a biological model. So in this case, what we're interested in is two things. The first is vertical scale of organization. So this is where we go from like molecular biology on the bottom to whole organisms on the top, and maybe like, ecological factors or communities above that. So you have in biology of this vertical scale of organization from like molecular phenomena to cells to organs to whole organisms to, so that makes sense in biology, and it might not make sense in other areas, but that's how we think about vertical organization. So a model that models molecular interactions or gene expression might be down here. It's maybe not appropriate for to sort of unify directly with a whole organism model. This is a spherical cow, which is where you have you're modeling an organism without too much detail. So that brings us to our other axis, which is the level of detail. And so the level of detail is defined as spatial resolution or number of components. So in this case, we have only, like the spherical cow, where I'm just modeling a cow maybe as like the outer phenotype and like that it produces milk or not. That's not a very good model of a cow, but it gets some of the job done. Now, you move on this axis and you try to get more and more realistic. You try to model every cell or every molecular interaction or every behavior that it does, and that's you're going down this axis. So I mean that's one way to think about this continuum of modeling fidelity. Another way to think about it is this degree of predictability, which is how much can the model predict. Can it predict every behavior or just some of the behaviors? Can maybe it just predict like a binary decision, or can it predict every possible behavior? And we talked about this in terms of neuromatch. Your model can, you want to build a model that can predict everything, but maybe that's not even possible. This is versus biological accuracy, which is realism, which is where, again, you have like this maybe a very simple model of a cow either producing milk or not, versus like hyperrealism, which is like every cell, modeled with everything inside the cell, and then every behavior. And so when you get up to this, the extremes of both of these axes, you get hyperrealism, which is where you have basically what amounts to that organism. And so that's my thinking about that. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the sort of how to think about like maybe embodiment, because that's one aspect of modeling. But maybe this is where Jesse can kind of tell me what he's thinking about in terms of embodiment. What kind of a continuum are you thinking about here? And I'll pull up my the whiteboard, and we'll gotta go through this.
Yeah, and it's I'm very fortunate to have time to talk about this here, because I feel like I'll try to point out my initial, like, how it started, where it's going, stuff of like what were we originally. This came about in a broad sense, and maybe perhaps not as well contextualized to the We Robot project or the methodology project as it could be. And I think I've tried to contextualize it more in the space of a lot of our recent discussions. But originally it was basically, I think originally it was quite indeterminate in terms of like, are we talking about embodiment as a process or a feature like earlier? Are we talking about it in terms of like the quality of a model, or how something is represented in the like, are we trying to, for lack of better terms, almost like quantify like like a developmental robot as like, okay, on the spectrum of like, on a spectrum of a very disembodied model, like, I don't know, this isn't really a model, but like the conception, maybe even conception is a way to start, but like and again, this is not really what I want the finished product to be, but like you have the I guess the concept or a conceptual model would be you have the brain in the vat, the brain in the jar. It's like you have the brain and then you have it like removed and have sort of a body thing around it. And then like further, much more towards embodiment would be, a developmental robotic entity that's, has an actual physical being and some programming that's not, not quite there. And I'm not even sure if that should be, like full embodiment. I think that's one of the questions. Like, what is full embodiment? Is that like a human being? And like a really interesting question, and I was like,
just giving it some features here.
oh yeah, no, I'm thinking like a really interesting question, which I haven't thought about until this moment, is could there be something more embodied than a human being, and what would that look like? What is the scale of embodiment actually doing? Like, is there a finite limit, or would something be more embodied than a human being? Or is embodiment almost is embodiment becoming like synonymous in this specific example only? Is embodiment becoming synonymous with degree of like amount of feedback processed by the system in a physical sense? Like if we added more senses somehow to a human being, would it become more embodied? If we had more sensory feedback between in the world, would it be more embodied? Like, I don't know. That's something I haven't thought about at all until this moment. So.
Well, this is very helpful. Yeah, I think. So what you're saying is that like humans have a certain amount of feedback. Like we have our hands and our feet and everything, and then if you had like an enhanced sense of, if we had eyes, we have two eyes that are kind of in the front of our heads. If we had eyes in the back of our heads, that would be a greater sense of embodiment. And maybe if you think about like cameras, our camera technologies now, this is actually driving greater embodiment, because so it's like human capabilities and then plus cameras, because our cameras are actually pretty good now. Or like we talked about with artificial eyes or artificial retinas, where you lose your sight and then you lose your connection to the visual cortex, and then you might have some camera technology or something that restores that visual sense and maybe taps into the visual cortex and reclaims some of that ability to see. So I mean, there are different ways you can think of embodiment there. The brain in the jar, of course, is now if you had a camera that was connected to a brain in a jar, that would make this a little bit more embodied. So if you had brain in a jar plus camera, that would be like somewhere out in this part of the continuum as opposed to here. So you have the brain in a jar alone, brain in a jar with a camera, the human body alone, which might actually be here. So the non-augmented human, and then the augmented human.
Yeah, and I would, I think this is implicit in what I'm saying, but getting sensory inputs or feed in points is one thing, and then I think, and I wonder, I don't really know how to deal with this yet, but just like something that I'm thinking about is like, that's one thing, and then having sort of the, I don't really like, I say this begrudgingly, but having the the RAM and the quality of your processor, the internal hardware and then some of the software to process it, like do you have the cognitive ability, the cognitive capacity to do it, you know? And then this makes me think a lot of our conversations about cognitive offloading, a lot about even the thing. So some of the sampling rate information as well. Like is embodiment. What's embodiment have to do with in terms of the sampling rate? We had a big conversation about that at in Chicago.
Yeah.
It's like you know, I'm hesitant and almost frowning at myself to use the words this way, but just to kind of put it out there, like is a fly's sense of vision more embodied than a human being's because it has a much higher sampling rate in that one area? I don't know. Like, is that how does that affect things? You know, I don't really like bringing that up, but it's something that's on my mind.
Well, I don't like with the super sampling. I don't think it's really any more embodiment, but it depends now. If the fly can use that information effectively, I guess it is. But it's now with the super sampling of visual information, it's really about getting a better sense of the physical world. So you know, it's like in that sense you have the speed advantage. So the fly is able to see the world at a higher sampling rate. So they can see like changes in like if there's a predator that's moving very, you know, quickly or very slowly, they can make all those distinctions. Whereas, you know, if you're trying to swat the fly can see you starting to move your hand, so it immediately knows where to go. Whereas you can't necessarily catch the fly because the fly is always ahead of you in that loop. But that isn't necessarily embodiment, that's just like a response. But, you know, you can think of you had like a body that was, you know, like a robot where you had, you know, they were able to use the sensory information in different ways to, or that it interacted with the body. So maybe you had like sensors in different parts of the robot that were, you know, differential sensing capacity. So, you know, you could switch your camera from like 20 frames a second to like 200 frames a second at any point if you needed more information. And you could draw like from that perspective, from like the left side or the right side if you needed it. And so that would be like maybe where there's enhanced embodiment. It's still not like, you know, it's just in this sense, it's more like kind of using the body as a sort of framework for guiding sensory ability, but still it's technically embodiment, I guess.
Yeah, I think I think this is an interesting discussion. I'm particularly like my mind is what will be more embodiment? Like that question is sticking with me, and I think it's interesting. Like you could say is a and like I feel like I'm using embodiment in a way that it's not. I think I'm kind of creating a new term. I don't think this is quite, you know, the conventional way or necessarily how I want to use this. But like what I don't know quite what I'm talking about yet in this sense. But like what you know, seeing it, putting it on a spectrum and putting a human body. There's like, you know, even developmental stages of you know a newborn baby in a few years, and like because there's things that develop in that there's things that are developing in that sense, and so it's becoming more embodied. And then what is beyond human? Like, what is that? Are we getting to like, you know, cyborgs and post-human stuff and transhumanism? Maybe, I don't know. But and so I mean, I want to kind of finish whatever thoughts here, and then maybe move to contextualizing a bit more for the project, because I think that I think this is an important thing to bring up.
Yeah.
Can I actually see the first page in your board again?
Yeah. Let's see. There you go.
So yeah. So where I'm at currently with this, and for the this is a really interesting question in and of itself, and we're probably not going to have a final conclusion right now about it. In the context of the We Robot cognitive interfaces poster, which is very, again, it's extremely, it's a lot of theory and kind of putting together some ideas, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technology and a little bit about some of the law or social stuff. But the theory, the evolution of the theory has been, let me look at my thing for a second here. Basically, I'm going to set it up I'm going to borrow from the SCQA protocol, I guess, which is like situation, the complication in the situation, the question we're asking, and what the answer to the question is. And I'm basically saying the situation is kind of I'll say, very generally speaking, the stalemate in cognitive science, or more so just the difficulties of understanding the relationship between I really like how Fuchs is talking about it, like the internal and external state of an agent, the objective external body and the internal body, the body problem in that sense, or the evolution of the mind-body problem is basically what kind of part of it. So the situation is like, I say stalemate there. The complication is we need new methodology for this. Or is there a lack of it? Or we would like there to be more methodology that works as we want to do or something. And the question in this case, for the purposes of this conference, my original question is going to be like, can we use virtual or augmented reality to move that forward? And the answer that I'm going to propose in the poster is, we don't know yet, but here's some of the cognitive science work towards a methodology that we found to be an interesting path, kind of quoting basically what Cognitive Futures Reading Group has been about, like looking at the Varela stuff, looking at future stuff, going in that direction. And then I'm also going to blend that with a bit of talk about some technologies and some prospective things I see happening, and certain. The conference itself is about like law and society, like it's very much about like regulation and from the end. So this poster in particular is like 90% not about that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to include that in it because it is relevant, and actually hopefully Valeria can help me out with that. I've been talking to her a bit more again by happenstance. But so that's sort of okay, I might share my screen really quick.
Okay, yeah.
Can I just ask a couple of things?
Yeah.
I think we both posted things about people having an extra limb or an extra finger or something, and learning to control it, and then starting to and then like a switch happening in their brain where it's like it's a part of them, right? So where would that fall? And is that person now more embodied?
Actually.
I like it's an interesting discussion, and
Yeah.
yeah, maybe we want a different word, but thinking about that and thinking also about sensory deprivation tanks, but and then like what is their level of embodiment, or how's their level of embodiment changed when you're doing that,
Right.
and then just a third example, someone who's in solitary confinement for a very long time, right? Does their level of embodiment change? It's like,
yeah, I like this. Yes.
I'm not sure where all those fall, but
Right.
Yeah.
And these are those are the questions I feel like, even thinking about it from like a more I don't want to say philosophical, but I'm really thinking about this. This discussion as I really like it in terms of the methodology project as the lens, because I feel like what I've been dancing around, at least in this conversation, has been it's almost like I almost want to use like totally different. I don't want to use the word embodiment. I want to talk like, because like I think like if you I'm not going to reference certain science fiction things, but like if you just happen to have like a bunch more limbs, like if you had like 20 limbs on your body as a human being, are you more embodied? Versus like this is kind of what I'm trying to get at. Like there's sort of physical sense data inputs, but there's also the other axis is your ability to process it, your ability to do something with it. Like there's a reason why humans haven't been compelled to grow 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 other limbs. I probably don't be cool.
I mean, I was also thinking about the fly example and wondering, does the fly really kind of use attention in the same way, the way we think about it? And this kind of goes back to the, I'm sure somebody can remind me who wrote the like to be a bat paper.
Oh yeah.
That.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if we had access to the fly's, thinking, or if we had access to the fly's data stream, would we even be able to kind of control that? Or I assume it would be the same kind of thing where we would learn to control it in the same ways that is, learning to add an extra finger or something like that. But at the same time, yeah, but maybe not.
Right.
Yeah.
There also seems to be an important difference between like having, more limbs, so more tactile input and more ability to control the world, versus having a sensory organ that is unlike the ones that we have, that is like, there's like a qualitative difference as opposed to just a quantitative difference. So I think that's important for the question of like, what would it mean to be more embodied? Because if we had another sense that was like qualitatively different from the ones that we have, that seems to be a more clear case of like being more embodied in a sense, whereas just having more limbs, I don't know about that. One other thought that I was having as we were talking about that spectrum of disembodied to embodied is so there's like the developmental time scale, but there's also just like through our daily lives, I think we can be more or less embodied depending on what we're doing. So I think of like the flow state as maybe being the most embodied versus, sitting on a Zoom call, maybe not being so much. So I think that, like just through our daily lives, depending on what we're doing, we can be more or less embodied.
Yeah. And I think Oh, so we're gonna say.
Well, I was just gonna say I think that's super interesting, but it's funny because I would have said that the flow state was my like least embodied. But that's what I was. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
I could see that going either way, and depending on like, and so I feel like to be now I'm gonna take. I do want to finish. Let's see what. Time is of the essence, but
Yeah.
I do want to say two things. One, I want to finish. I will wrap up with the conclusion of what we're doing in the poster, just to kind of prime that as the final note to end on before to think about and get feedback from later. But before that, I wanna put on my. I don't have a hat here, but I'll do my fake neuromatch. Thank you, Brian. My critique, my angry critical jerk hat, and say, I'll talk about myself, but like the one who's gonna say, what the hell are you guys talking about? Embodiment is just a way to talk about models. Why are you talking about physical experiences in your life? Like, this is garbage. Like, this is not what we're focused on. Like, you're using embodiment totally the wrong way. And I say that to be like, I think if we're gonna talk about, and like, I think everything we brought up is wicked valuable to explore. And I think those are going to be really important questions, especially for the project. I think we need to. I think the more we can address those weird gray areas, the better it's going to be. But with that said, I feel like for the diagram we're talking about, I feel like embodiment in and of itself maybe is best to speak about the almost like the academic theoretical sense of, are we using models that are embodied? Because I feel like when we talk about our experiences and adding things to them, and I say this like I brought us down this path, so like I'm the problem, I'm why we're here. But like I feel like if we're talking about a spectrum of embodiment in a theoretical model sense, I think that's I think we're limited to like almost like comparisons of models in cognitive science across that spectrum. But I think there should be, for the sake of that specific usage of it, but I think the more we can add all the things we're talking about to actually, those are like the big boy and big girl questions, the big whatever gender you want. Like those are the questions that you want to, that's where we want to go with this. But like for the sake of, introducing what do you mean more embodied or less embodied? I feel like the theoretical question for that is the more boring one.
Yeah.
So like, how do we talk about it? Even I'm looking. I think the diagram that yes, yeah. Is Rodney Brooks, I forgot, where's Rodney Brooks on the spectrum of like being representation heavy or not? Is he representationalist, or is he more like radical embodied cognition? I know he's working with Gary Marcus. But.
Yeah.
It is a step, right? It's like a step towards embodied cognition, writing mostly just before Varela and the embodied mind and all that stuff. It's kind of the precursor. But he talks explicitly about embodiment in terms of models like this. So,
Yeah. I think the diagram that Bradley kind of fleshed out is helpful. I think maybe for the sake of this poster and the kind of the thrust of what we're trying to say in this poster, and I do want to really highlight everything we talked about is super relevant, I think, especially to the methodology project, which is slowly seeping into this poster anyway, as we can tell. For the poster, I think a really simple, I think they're gonna, I have to figure out which diagrams I want to include, because I feel like I kind of wanted to make a very simple diagram of the reductionist worldview, like the thing that Futures criticizes, where it's just like, here's like a really big dividing line between big barrier between internal state, internal state of the agent, that's the lived subjective body, and then the big division of the external objective body, and you know, he says it really well, where it's like, yeah, like the reductionist paradigm has said, well, everything that we can measure and have easy access to quantitatively is external objective body. We can measure that and take all its parts and pull it apart, and we'll use that to measure stuff. But anything that's not there, we can't touch, and it's just weird subjective. You know, we can't. But that's out of bounds, and that's not science, and we're not going to deal with that. I'm being a bit, you know, loose here, but I feel like a simple diagram about that might be cool. I'm trying to plan out in the poster, like, you know, how much do I want to devote to these things in the diagram space of the poster? I could put that. I could put like a bunch of diagrams, and honestly, maybe that would be better for the sake of this being a theory heavy poster. I'm not sure yet, but I'm playing around with that, and I know it's kind of late, so thank you for all the discussion that we've had so far.
Yeah.
I think everything about embodiment in the expansive sense is stuff we should follow up on. And we will
all the
follow up
things,
on that.
yes. Yeah, in terms of posters, you had asked me also about if we had a
Template or something.
template. We don't, but you know, I like to do different things for posters depending on where it's kind of going. But the best policy for posters is to be very visual and to have like a lot of images that, you know, have some explanation, but it's not like, you know, a wall of text. I mean, that's obviously like you have to explain some things, and sometimes you want to have things that people can read, but a lot of times with posters, especially virtual posters, you know, people are gonna, you know, zoom into them and read them, and then they have to zoom out and then go somewhere else, and you know, it's just kind of like a huge book. And it's like, you know, it's like, how do I do this? Do I want to walk across it? Or so it's like really hard to navigate and to focus on different things. So you can make things into diagrams.
Particularly for this conference, I think original, like the most loose and fast, like whatever you want to do conference was like early level NeuroMatch. Like they were kind of like just trying to give you a very making. This one I think is a few steps above that, but still, like if I wanted to be totally more, I say this with a look of almost disgust on my face, but like, if I want to be totally right-brained and creative in my poster and just have like a big set of images, almost like a trail of like, here's our story and images, like I think it'd be fine. Like I could do that here. And maybe I should actually lean more in that direction, because I think the narrative story diagram approach, I mean, that's kind of what, in a more serious sense, that's what a good, you know, research posters are anyway, kind of. But like, I think I could probably lean heavy on diagrams and almost make it more like a picture book kind of a thing. And that actually might be also easier than writing out all the details on the poster. So, you know, this is good. This has been really helpful. I wanted to have a little bit more. I'll show really quickly what is existing.
All right.
But I kind of want to. I'll solicit more feedback, and this is just like the latest skeleton. That's the same as I showed everybody last time. But this hasn't even been updated. But I'm really enjoying. I really like framing it as the body problem I talked about, the reductionist stuff. Varela's, and not really just Varela, but I'm using his name here for my own reference. Like the embodied mind is becoming aware, the critique towards VR, towards embodiment. And basically I'm framing it like, can we use VR or the whole mixed extended reality tool set to look at dealing with this problem? That's kind of the thrust of the poster. I'm going to mention some of the stuff, the specifics here, and maybe I could make a very easy picture diagrams about some of these things. I might put them on I would make a very basic chart with like, you know, technological depth and what it does, and versus like ease of use, and like I think that's an easy chart to make, that will explain kind of what I did in my AI, the presentation of them before. So yeah, that's basically where it's at. This is again, this is a great, very useful conversation today on many fronts. I feel like it addresses the immediate needs of the poster, and then a lot of exciting stuff to follow up on that. I want to take notes on what we said, actually. I might go back and if anybody took notes, I know Bradley took some notes, but like, let's save the discussion, because I think all of our embodiment, like future, what's beyond embodiment, what the eyes and the shunting rate and limbs and all the conversations we had about that were like, those are going to be like the new leads to follow in some ways. So yeah, okay, that's all. I'll leave it at that. I don't even know. We can do. I know it's kind of the end of the hour, so
so we can maybe do the professional development next week.
That's fine.
And then, there's no real news on the submissions front. There are a couple of things, but I don't think there's anything that's upcoming.
With the free energy,
that's this weekend.
Tomorrow.
But this is
yeah.
Oh, Morgan.
Yeah, sorry. And just so I'm sure I'm on which one that is. Is that in the free energy?
That's the active live stream.
Yeah.
That's this weekend.
Yeah, that's right.
But they'll have that on YouTube, so like you can watch it after. It's not like you have to be there.
Oh, okay. That's good, because I can't.
But they have a robotics conference, so we'll put that in the Slack later. And then but I'll get into some of the more submissions next week as well. So one of the things I wanted to talk about before we go today is, and I know Amanda's here, so she'll like this. There are some papers on, and I talked about this in the COG Futures group, but there are a number of papers that came out on the scope of cognitive science. And this is like maybe a critique of the Nunez paper on whatever happened in cognitive science. So I think this was in Topics of Cognitive Science. I think one of them was from Cognitive Science, the journal. So there are these 3 papers that came out recently, 21, 22, that kind of engage with this idea of what cognitive science is as a field. So the first paper is Rick Dale from UCLA. Now this person's in the Department of Communications, so it's not psychology or a cog sci department necessarily, although I don't know what UCLA's cog sci group looks like. But in any case, this is his perspective on the mindset of cognitive science. So the aims of cognitive science have been passed to us from the ones that inspired its founding, to transmit the excitement surrounding the paradigm shift in the study of cognition made possible by the synthesis of artificial intelligence, psychology, and linguistics. And that's just one take. That's from 1977. So this is like this idea that you're going to shift your paradigm from like psychology or like behaviorism to this idea of merging psychology with other areas to get a richer view of cognition. So this is just kind of like criticizing the journal Cognitive Science and its mission. So this journal, Cognitive Science, the present author guidelines state multidisciplinary study of minds and other intelligent systems to publish the highest quality articles of multidisciplinary concern on cognition from multiple perspectives, including anthropology, artificial intelligence, education, linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology. So we've added in the words multidisciplinary twice, and then we've added in all these additional fields that have, so basically you're trying to bridge as much territory as possible. Cognitive science does not just cut across these fields, it also cuts into them. It can challenge, alter, and expand theories in one field by importing elements from others. But who is doing the importing and exporting? Are they cognitive scientists or members of each distinct field? Or both? Do they belong in cognitive science departments or in departments of cognitive science. I am inspired by the idea that cognitive science thrives primarily as a scientific mindset that projects its focus outside the space of traditional disciplines. Indeed, if we could point to our fingers to a rigid institutionalization in universities and programs and curricula, cognitive science may have become something else. Focusing too closely on traditional disciplines gives entrenched administrative structures too much sway in how we think about making these connections between minds, brains, bodies, communities, and cultures. So, thinking about like this in terms of how different disciplines are adding to the pot is just kind of like, sort of, is that like taking these silos and like throwing them into a stew that may or may not taste good? Or is it like taking those ideas and kind of forming something new right at that intersection and really kind of, eschewing some of the more traditional administrative stuff? So this is an interesting kind of thing to think about because, really cognitive science does exist in these structures of people coming from different fields. And then, right. So cognitive science is a disruptive discipline, right? This is the same disruption we talk about in technology, but it's, academic. So he gets into some of these disruptions, and then, kind of getting into what kind of a journal is this. And then he says, okay, where is this? This is, of course, a tongue-in-cheek reference to a methodological anarchist, which is talking about some of the, it's actually a philosophy of science reference here, kind of talking about maybe the norms of cognitive science and who's in the norm, and maybe we should cite people outside of that norm. But maybe there is something to it. In some of cognitive science's early lore, at the Macy conferences, Warren McCullough served as the meeting's anti-disciplinarian hawk by ensuring that its towering attendees like Margaret Mead and Norbert Wiener did not overtly respect their own disciplinary boundaries. So Margaret Mead was an anthropologist. Norbert Wiener, I think, was an engineer of some type. But you have those disciplinary boundaries that you're used to in other contexts, and then you come to the Macy conference, and of course now you have to sort of go beyond that. So those, I've been to conferences like that, and it's a challenge to get people to think outside of their own discipline. Sometimes people will come to these conferences and they'll give a talk that's actually pretty discipline specific. They do it in a very discipline oriented way, and really to get the most out of it, you need to have like a different format and really kind of engage with other things and leave things open. So there must be a balance between traditional disciplinary diversity and whatever is next for us. We can attend duly to mixing disciplines, but with a healthy skepticism about their reality too. And so he gives some ideas about what is next. The first is disciplinary diversity. The second is diversity writ large. And then there's, some suggestions on that. Then what is next? And then this gets into kind of the things. And this is like rethinking the journal Cognitive Science, I believe. So they're actually putting this into practice. And so that's that paper. That's a nice overview of some of the issues with, always rethinking interdisciplinary field.
Yeah. I really want to look at the paper more and some of the references in it too. Like even I'm curious about like the reference about even the Macy's conference one, just as a fun thing. But like I think that's really I'm really happy to see that paper. Was Dale the editor of it, or who was?
I think I think he's just the author. Where am I? Here we go. Okay. Just an author who made a contribution to this, but I think it's like maybe it's on the editorial board, but
okay.
Yeah. Okay. So this is from Topics in Cognitive Science, and Topics is run by the Cognitive Science Society, like Cognitive Science, but it's like usually focuses on different debates in the field, different parts of the field, and it's really oriented towards like maybe like sort of contentious issues. So this article, this is part of a Romo Hart Prize issue honoring a luminary in the field. So this is integration by parts, collaboration and topic structure in the CogSci community. So the abstract reads, is cognitive science interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary? And there's a difference between the two, because interdisciplinary implies some sort of like integration, whereas multidisciplinary is like kind of like where we kind of like sometimes in our meetings where we shift from area to area. So today we've talked about computational neuroscience, cell biology, embodiment. Now we're talking about the structure of cognitive science. That's multidisciplinary, but interdisciplinary, we do that as well. It's just a little bit different. That would be like if we spent 30 minutes at the end synthesizing all of that. Now we don't necessarily do that, at least not in the meeting, but that's the difference basically. We contribute to this debate by examining the authorship structure and topic similarity of contributions to the Cognitive Science Society, and I think they mean the conference, from 2000 to 2019. So this is like bibliometrics that they're doing. They're doing a bibliometric analysis. Our analysis focuses on graph theoretic features of the co-authorship network, edge density, transitivity, and maximum subgraph size, as well as clustering within the space of scientific topics. So these are all network theory terms, and it's fortuitous because I just attended a network science conference this week, so my mind is in this space. It's kind of interesting to see this. We also combine structural and semantic information with an analysis of how authors chose their collaborators based on interests and prior collaborations. So then they compare cognitive science to the Vision Science Society, which is filled with not only, well, it's actually not just psychologists. You have medical professionals, you have people in optometry and other areas where they're interested in vision, but it's a little bit different because it's not like, it's tough to say that vision science, maybe it is like integrated in the same way cognitive science is, maybe not, but it's an interesting comparison. So then they compare the data from CogSci with Vision Science Society, and then they try to predict collaborations in the 2020 CogSci proceedings. So our results suggest that collaboration across authors and topics within cognitive science has become increasingly integrated in the last 19 years. So in the last 19 years, in the 21st century, CogSci is becoming more and more integrated. So, you know, some of these issues from like the 20th century may not be as pressing anymore, but still it's interesting to see how these are coming together. More broadly, we argue that a formal quantitative approach, which combines structural co-authorship information and semantic topic analysis, gives us some insight into the interdisciplinary nature of CogSci. So I don't know if they have any, here's a network here. So this is a co-authorship network of CogSci on the top and Vision Science Society on the bottom. And on the left, you have networks from sort of the cusp of the 21st century, 2000 and 2001. And you see that there's a lot less integration in both cases. You have these little modules that are disconnected. Well, I guess they don't show the connections overtly, but yeah, it's pretty disconnected. You have these different areas that are sort of doing their own thing. And then you see, but later on, in 2019, you see this change. And the change is that the fields are bigger, but there's also more integration in certain places. So you can see that they're in network graphs are kind of hard to understand because they're quote unquote disembodied. So it's hard to know kind of there's no axis here. It's just kind of organized around in the sort of the most visually appealing way. But these nodes basically, it shows that there's more connection between nodes in certain areas. And we can't really define these from this graph, but it just gives you a kind of a qualitative sense. So I don't know if they have their data open so that people can look at it, but that would be a good thing to look into. because you can get the data and just mine it. Aside from building a graph, you can do other things with it. So they talk about the co-authorship network, and this is stuff that's really, I think, useful if you're interested in bibliometrics. It's a useful approach to understanding things about different scientific fields. It's an interesting approach. You just basically take a bibliography, you take some key data out of it, you take like keywords and dates and different properties of the citations, and then you try to find a correlation structure with other citations, and then you look at where they fall in a graph, if they're connected or not, and then there are different statistics that'll tell you about the structure of the graph and the connections, and then that can tell you something about these. So maximum subgraph size is a good example. This is where you have subgraphs, which are these like little collaborations, and they're within this major graph of the field. And so a subgraph is where you get connected elements. So these are like collaborations or emerging subfields. And you can see in CogSci, it's actually increased. In Vision Science Society, it's increased, but it's increased actually more in Vision Science Society. And there's like a big jump in like 2007, 2008. So that's an interesting thing. I don't know if it tells us a lot, but it tells us that there's some, you can see between the fields that there's some difference. So the next step would be to go and look and see in the literature what's going on. So yeah, this is a very good analysis of this, and it's very statistical here. So you have a lot of information in this to predict maybe what's next for cognitive science from a quantitative standpoint. Oh, okay, so all code used in this analysis can be found here in this GitHub repo. Then we have some of the data here as well. So I can make this paper available, and then the final paper is this quantifying interdisciplinarity in cognitive science and beyond. So this is another quantitative heavy paper. This is topics in cognitive science. This is actually, what was that?
With the same author as before?
No, I think these are different authors. But this is actually this is part of a topic, commentaries in Rafael Nunez's article, What Happened to Cognitive Science. So this is actually directly related to that article. This is actually Rick Dale, who was the author of the first paper, and then two other authors. So in this paper, the abstract reads, recent publications have lamented the dominance of psychology in cognitive science. And I think we've talked about that in the meeting where, if it's psychology, that was one of the reasons why we have cognitive science, because not only was behaviorism ascendant, but there was a shift in psychology, but there was also this need to bring in other areas and to give it a little bit more of an explanatory integration. Like, what is cognition? As psychology probably is not enough to explain that, so we need all these other fields. But psychology is tended to dominate because they do a lot of the experimental work, and ultimately, if you're talking about brain and behavior, it's sort of parallel to psychology. So, but this lamentation sort of relies on a limited definition of collaboration between fields. So we call for a renewed conception of interdisciplinarity as a mixture of expertise. We describe an information theoretic measure of interdisciplinarity and apply it to multi-authored published articles. Results suggest that cognitive science journals mix expertise more than topically related journals. So this is where you have this idea where, you're mixing, it's really about mixing expertise. And I don't know what a lot of times that's like, you have to bring in people from different disciplines. But sometimes, you can, in psychology, you have different types of expertise, and so and then even if you have like a paper with authors from different disciplines, what are they contributing? You might just bring in like a statistician to do an analysis, but not necessarily contribute to the concepts in the paper, the conceptual tone of the paper. So cognitive science really does mix expertise more than topically related journals. We suggest that perceptions of diminishing interdisciplinarity may be in part due to the emergence of different theoretical perspectives, and use a semantic model to illustrate this argument. So this is maybe like where theoretical perspectives are emerging that sort of, don't necessarily require this interdisciplinarity. I haven't read through the paper in detail, but that's where they're going with this. We conclude by describing some benefits of this broader conception. So basically they're saying we just need to rethink what we mean by interdisciplinarity, and we'll see that cognitive science does not have a problem that Nunez predicted. So in 2019, Nunez offered a rather grim assessment of the disciplinary composition of cognitive science. Bibliometrically, the field has been largely subsumed by cognitive psychology, and educationally, it exhibits a striking lack of curricular consensus, raising questions about the future. So, but they're saying, well, maybe not, because if you actually look at it using different disciplines, so if you use departments as the sole metric of interdisciplinarity, this is what Nunez was drawing from. This offers an incomplete picture. The notion of discipline is often in flux from decade to decade. So, just because you're in a psychology department doesn't mean that you're just like a classical psychologist, although we might argue about that because it depends on the department. It depends on, what you mean by like crossing boundaries. So that's all, that's a critique of this approach too. I don't think, I'm not quite sure. If we went through this paper in detail, I'd probably but this is a picture of, mean JSD of art. What does JSD mean? Not sure, but usually you want to define your abbreviations, but Jensen-Shannon divergence, right? So that's Jensen-Shannon divergence is like an information metric. So it's like you're looking at the divergence of two measurements, and you're making that, and it's just a measure that they use. So this is the mean value of this measure of articles per journal, along with the 95% confidence interval when controlling for Gini and log total numbers, number of publications, all co-authors. So this is normalized, just basically normalized Jensen-Shannon divergence. So you have this measurement here, you have these journals, and then you can see that the higher number, of course, is more interesting to us. So this is the more diverged expertise level. So you can see that when there's less divergence, these two Gaussian distributions are mostly overlapping. In this case, they're not overlapping very much. And this greater divergence is where you have individuals of different expertise. So this could be like one field in psychology, one field in linguistics, as opposed to like two psychologists who specialize in different things. And so then you can see that topics in cognitive science is at the high end of this. Neuropsychological review is also at the higher end of this. Cognitive science is at the higher end of this. And at the lower end of this is Journal of Memory and Language, or annual reviews of neuroscience. And one might ask, what are they actually measuring here? Because annual reviews of neuroscience ideally should have more diversity, but it could also be that you have single authors in this, so it doesn't really pick that up. So there are differences in this measure, but this gives you a decent idea of this divergence of expertise. So they really do give a really nice quantitation of it. And then they use the same measure across years of cognitive science. So there's an increasing Jensen-Shannon divergence over the last decade or so, where it's increasing. And then this is a hierarchical cluster analysis. This is very quantitative, using a pairwise cosine distance matrix of the document loadings for these different areas. And so this is actually the structure of, this is like a cluster analysis where the clusters come, things cluster together based on their similarity. And then this is like the nest. So it kind of looks like a phylogenetic tree. In fact, it's a very similar method, except it's hierarchical cluster analysis. So you have like the thing that's like at the more general, and then more specific clusters come down like this, and you have things that cluster together, and those things are the most similar. So for example, you have these different topics. You have Bayesian, symbolic, and connectionism. Symbolic and connectionism actually cluster together. Bayesian clusters along with that. And then on the other part of this tree, you have ecological, which I guess means ecological psychology. Then you have distributed and embodied, and then inactive and dynamical are down here. So this forms another cluster that's separate from symbolic and connectionism. It's kind of interesting. I don't really know what it means, but I guess it means that these things are commonly cited together and talked about together. So this is just a way to like look at these things. And then again, there's a semantic model showing two potential collaborators whose prior work is predicted to involve disparate methods or theories. And you can see that you have this map of like their different fields, different authors, and what their expertise covers. So this is kind of an interesting way to look at co-authorship and diversity of topics. So that's all I'm going to talk about there. I think we're done for today. I think that's a good discussion, though. I think to continue having. Did you have any comments about that? Immediate comments, I guess.
Super interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading those papers. Those are good papers for this topic and time in general, Bradley. So thank you. But I appreciate all the discussion earlier. I don't want to say any more now.
Okay. So I think we're maxed out on time. I'll put those papers in the Slack, and we can continue to discuss those. And maybe we can pick up on this in the Cognition Futures group, and yeah. All right, it's a great meeting. Thanks everyone for attending.
Yep. Take care, everybody.
Yeah. See you next week.
Thank you.